Afternoon, everybody, or good morning or given evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm talking to you from Canada. Last week I was talking to you from Argentina, and I'm excited because we are now in the middle of the third week of this course. We've done quite a bit, from Aimee's introduction and first module to my second module, now the third module. Um, I think all of you are in the middle of your fourth week of this course. How time moves quickly. So, as always, this is an open office hour. You can pretend that I'm sitting in my office, which I am, but virtually. And if you have any questions or comments or uh, ideas for a topic for discussion, please feel free to drop it into the chat. Our teaching assistants will pick it up, give it to me, and then I'll be reading through them to answer questions as they come in. Um, so the topic for this week is the AI industry, in quotes, because it's not necessarily an industry, depending on how you want to look at it. It might be an extension of existing industries, it might be a new thing altogether. But the fact remains that there is a lot of venture capitalist money flowing through companies offering AI products right now. And AI in this instance is defined loosely. So, as people have pointed out on Twitter, generative AI is not necessarily predictive technologies. So machine learning has been a thing for many years. Machine learning has been a thing in production since I would say the late 1990s. And predictive machine learning models are generally designed to classify or annotate. And because of this, we draw a distinction between generative technologies and predictive technologies. And the fact remains that language models, because they are capable of both prediction and generating text, they are technically both predictive and generative. And so when someone says generative AI and they're referring to language models, they might not necessarily be referring to a generative technology, but a predictive technology. So when looking at the AI industry, it's good to keep this in mind and keep a little bit of a spot in your mind open to react to claims of generative technologies where there is not necessarily something being generated. So if someone is talking to you about transcribing or predicting samples or creating complex data workflows, it might not be generative, but the company might be claiming it is. So it's a little bit hazy right now because everything is on the fly and people are coming up with terms in real time. So I wanted to make this module a bit of a deeper look at what sorts of companies are offering products right now and what red flags are to keep in mind when looking for products on the open market. So without further ado, we have our first question from Lynn Grainer. At the beginning of Module 3, you mentioned companies that research versus those that resell, and you do not include Microsoft in either category. Where does it fit? That's a bit of a that's a good question, first of all. I should have mentioned that there's a third category, and that's AI host. So Google, Amazon, and Microsoft all have their respective cloud offerings. It's GCP for Google, it's AWS for Amazon, and it's Azure for Microsoft. Microsoft was in the business of producing predictive technologies and generative AI models about 2 years ago, but that sort of dropped off as they realized that you can make more money hosting other people's models. And so right now, Microsoft makes a bundle making deals with Meta and other companies to run their technology on their platform. And what this means is that Microsoft is not necessarily reselling technology, nor are they necessarily developing or researching new technologies, but rather they are in the business of hosting technologies and models. And so while you can go to Microsoft Azure and hire them on and have them develop a model for you and run it on their platform, they're not necessarily reselling. And what that means is they don't fit precisely into the two categories that I laid out. The purpose of the two categories was to have them foil against each other. So the idea is that some companies are in the business of producing language models. Other companies resell those language models, but they don't necessarily make it clear that they are not making their own model. And that makes it a little bit confusing and potentially dangerous in the sense that they might be charging you a lot of money, but they might not necessarily be putting that money towards development. Or rather, the companies that resell models, they have a larger margin than the companies that develop models. It is expensive to make a language model. Well, it used to be really, really expensive, and now it's gotten a little bit cheaper. But back in 2020, to make GPT-3, I read one estimate that OpenAI spent about $10 to $20 million to train GPT-3. And even with Llama 2, as I believe, it's $1 to $2 million to produce a single model. And when you go to a company like Cohere and you ask them to make you a bespoke language model, they can charge you, or rather, they'll quote you up to $500,000 to produce a single language model that is of a foundation quality. So it's very large. It's been fed 1 trillion tokens. It's a usable, functional language model. Good evening, everyone. So it is a little bit of concern for me, I think, when I was putting together the materials for this course, to think that some companies it's might be selling predictive or generative technologies, but they're not necessarily in the business of making their own. And if they're not in the business of making their own, then you have to wonder, is it not better to go directly to the source? Um, so moving on to the next question from A.L. Brignoni. Am I being silly to assume that BARD is an open AI model slash service for literary ChatGPT generating works? It is a little bit of a problem that it's named BARD, in my opinion, because it's out of the three. And I think people who are doing the second discussion question this week are beginning to realize BARD is the worst out of ChatGPT, Claude, and BARD for writing. It is much worse at writing than both ChatGPT and BARD. Claude. Claude is the best for at least creative writing. It might not necessarily be so for non-fictional AP style English, but it is certainly the case that BARD is not the one to be using if you want to generate literary ChatGPT works. BARD is good for other things. Last month, they began integrating it with Google Workspace. So the Workspace apps are like Google Docs, Slides, Sheets, Gmail, Think Your Notes, Keep. And you can ask it questions and it will go looking through all your different data sources and figure out the answer. And I had a question. So I've had a Google account, a Gmail account since about 2008. And I wanted to know, because I've been using it the whole time, I wanted to know if my writing style has changed significantly since 2008. I know it has because, I've gone through school and yada, yada, yada. So I asked Bard, thinking that it would have access to my email, to take a look at all my emails and tell me how it's changed over time. I found two problems. One is that Bard only seems to have access to the last 2 or 3 months of emails. And moreover, it doesn't seem to know who sent what email. More particularly, it doesn't know which emails I sent versus other people sending emails to me. And I think that's a little bit of a effort on Google's part to remain anonymous or to keep your data privacy a little bit cleaner. And it didn't know. And it was looking at the last 3 months and it made the determination that my email writing habits were changing significantly from email to email to email because, of course, for every email that I send, I receive, 5 to 10 to 20. So it was confusing all of them together. So BARD is not quite there yet. It's the most proof of concept-ish out of the three on the open market today. It is interesting, don't get me wrong, but BARD is, it was an earnest effort from a group of people at Google, but it's become slightly less developed and thought on and rash and built up as the other models. And that's probably par for the course for Google. They're in the habit of running out a proof of concept or a minimum viable product, and then it doesn't exactly work as people think it might. So, and then it ends up on killedbygoogle.com, which is a massive web page, single web page of every single product that Google has come out with, and then consequently get killed. So it's the Google graveyard, and there's hundreds of products in there by now. So BARD, anyway, if you have the choice, generally do not use BARD, I think is my advice, although my advice was not being asked. So Lynn Grainer is asking, or it's rather saying, BARD is also being integrated into the Android Smart Assistant. I've asked what happens in countries where BARD isn't available as standalone. That's a great question. My assumption is that it will just not be available. The Google Assistant has been around for a while. I remember it being very good back in 2016 or something. I think when it was called, what was it called at that point? Google. It was when they had the cards, so you could talk to Google and it would bring up relevant cards too. So if you're going on a flight later that day, it would bring up a card telling you how to get to the airport. It would bring up a card if you receive an interesting email. It doesn't seem to do that anymore. And moreover, its responses have been getting a little bit worse over time. So maybe if they integrate Bard or Palm, which is another major large language model that they have, that might turn into something interesting. So Beth Davids. Oh, no, first from A.L. Brignoni. Which of all these models are prompt friendly? They all work with prompts because they've been instruct tuned. When you're looking at a language model and you want to make the determination if they can react to prompts, you look for the keyword, which is prompt tuning, or instruction tuning, or instruct tuning, or instruct tuned. And all that means is they've been trained on a data set of question and answer, question and answer. And when we write prompts, we try to target how they write the questions in that data set. So Bard, Claude, and ChatGPT all react to prompts. I will trying to find my mouse. Okay. Next question from Beth Davids. How can we tell when AI is being incredibly, we have a raised hand here. I'm not sure what happens if I press on raised hand. I can't see what happened. I'm not sure. I'm sorry. It's best if you type your question, I think, into the chat. But the question is, how can we tell when AI is being incredibly smart and when it is incredibly dumb, which you've referred to as hallucinating? For example, AI can pass the bar exam, but it can't always pass basic questions a reasonable person asks. Yeah, so what's interesting about AI and machine learning and language models is that they figure out how to answer the question on their own. And we don't know, because of the nature of these models, exactly how they arrive at their solutions. And it's a little bit of a black box because it is a black box. These models have trillions of parameters and they come up with their own sense of the world and of how people talk to each other and logic and rhetoric. And so what that means is sometimes the way the neurons have settled through hundreds of hours and millions of hours of training is their neurons just happen to be settled in such a way that they're very good at answering some questions, but a little bit worse at answering other questions. But because they never see the world proper, because they've grown up in a featureless gray room, they don't see with their own eyes what a dog is, but they learn about dogs through writing. Sometimes we will find their knowledge goes a very far way just because of how the data was presented, just because of how they arrived at their solution as they maneuvered around the loss landscape, which is when a machine learning model tries to predict one word. If it's wrong, it will shift all of its neurons a little bit. And when it's wrong again, it'll shift all its neurons a little bit again. And eventually it arrives at the correct solution. And its neurons are configured in a certain way that the configuration also happens to be good for other problems, but it might also be bad for other problems. And it's difficult to know when it is good, when it is bad. And so the answer is we can't tell when it'll be very good and when it'll be not so good at a question. Anthropic in particular is doing a lot of research and trying to figure out if we can predict this very thing, if we can predict when it'll be good, predict when it'll be bad, and moreover, predict its biases. And what we're finding is these models are probably pretty good at common sense questions. And more specifically for the bar exam, it most likely memorized a whole bunch of questions, is my sense. So it might not even be the best at law questions. Okay, from Tomo Terada. I'm sending you a question by Liz Lifkin. Thank you. Hey, Sil, in the AI industry video, you mentioned something called Mirim for newsrooms, right? Let me find that right now. I mentioned it in last week's office hours. For some reason, the name is always very difficult to find. It's a little... I'll get back to you in a second. Sheesh. Okay, I'll find that anyway. So next question from Ellen Kuana. Are we automatically on mute and off camera? Indeed, this is a webinar format on Zoom. It makes it so I don't see any of you. I don't hear any of you, but I can see the chat. So I talk into the chat and I look at myself. And I hope people are on the other end listening. Okay. From Raj Rangarajan, would you know if ChatGPT is now available in India? I don't know. That's a great question. I was just in Argentina. I was speaking to someone who was a Knight Fellow who runs a journalism startup in India. I think he would know, but he might still be on his 26-hour flight back. Uh, okay, so Ellen found that apparently you can actually subscribe to ChatGPT Premium in India for $20 a month, but they don't adjust it for the local uh, rate of living. So that's probably not great on OpenAI's front. Um, I have found it a little bit frustrating, honestly speaking, with some of these technologies to teach them in a course where we have people joining us from 157 different countries. Language models are great. They have humongous privacy implications. And so companies in the US have been very hesitant to roll them out in other countries. And so while I was thankful to spend a couple of months in the States and be able to use Claude and Bard, they aren't, for example, available in Canada, nor were they available in Argentina. And that's problematic for people who want to learn about these different technologies and get a sense of why they're different from one another, how they're good, how they're not so good, and use these technologies um, uh, in their newsroom. But if you don't have access to the product, it's very difficult to get a sense of what is out there and what is possible if you're only using ChatGPT or Mistral or Llama 2. So I would encourage people to move forward and, if you don't have access to one of these models, use a VPN into the United States, use it like that. But also companies should be making a greater effort to roll these out to different countries. So Brignoni. In another life, I was an attorney in litigation. I could see courts having to deal with novel theories and defense generated by AI when there is no case law in point. That has happened. So in New York, I think there was um a lawsuit happening, and the defense attorney on this lawsuit, on the part of the defendant, was wanting to do some research to bring to the court. So they wanted to go and find precedent. And so they asked ChatGPT if there were other court cases or other lawsuits or litigations that were similar to the court case that he was sitting in. And so ChatGPT happily obliged and gave back a whole bunch of court cases, and the lawyer took it at point blank, wrote it up in one big document, and sent it over to the judge. And the judge took a look, was a little bit confused, I think, looked up the court citation numbers, and then found that the words, many of them were made up. And the lawyer admitted that they'd used ChatGPT. ChatGPT, the hallucination thing is just awful. And so I had a research paper from last year where I took the 9 Supreme Court justices and I trained a chatbot in each individual court justice. And I had the little micro robot judges or justices accept abstracts for different court cases, and they each decided on whether or not to flip prior precedent in response to this court case. And I found that my simulated Supreme Court actually, believe it or not, had a 70% accuracy in predicting whether individual justices would respond to the court case in one way or another. And that was without the model knowing anything about legal precedent, which is amazing. It would just make up laws, it would make up precedent, it would make up the legal rhetoric. It had no idea of what was actually legally allowed. But despite that, my simulated Supreme Court was above average, was above random accuracy in deciding whether the Supreme Court would move in one way or another. And my sense is that the models were just picking up on whether individual justices were more Republican or more Democratic leaning, because we do know there's a high correlation in how the Supreme Court justices vote and when they were elected to the Supreme Court in which administration. So if a president on the right or the left voted them into the Supreme Court, then that has a really major impact on how they vote. Because of course, it's in the States, there's such a high level of political separation like that. So all of that is to say, in the law world, these models might be better than people assume. What's scary is that they might not necessarily know about the law, but they could still be accurate or not accurate, and people will either believe them or not believe them or fail to check, and it's just a humongous problem. Okay, so the next question from Ileana Murakami. With so many new generative AI tools coming up and plugins coming out, it's hard to keep up and try most of them. What do you recommend to stay up on if we want to get the best out of the options? In which cases should we consider a subscription plan? Right. I would suggest using as many free tools as possible. So ChatGPT, Claude, and Bard are all free. And when you do decide on a model that you enjoy, check to see if they have an API available. So OpenAI, for example, has an API. And an API is a application programming interface, and all it does is it allows you to plug that model in to an existing workflow. And there's a certain tool which is actually pretty interesting for trying out prompts in particular. It's called Vellum. I came across it recently. I'll paste it into the chat here. Vellum.ai is nice because you can compare different models at the same time. So you can oh, I see. I'm talking into the host and panelists section. You can't see what I'm typing. Okay. So anyway, Vellum is interesting because you can compare Bard, you can compare Claude, you can compare ChatGPT all at once and see how the same prompt works with all of them. And then you can also upload your own documents and do semantic search and give your language model access to retrieval augmented generation. You can all do all sorts of nifty things with Vellum.ai. So if you want to get a better sense of which models are better, you can use Vellum.ai. Okay, so next question. Beth Davids. Is there something we can do to combat the inherent biases in AI, amplifying the perhaps minor biases of the programmers and data sets? This has been a question in the tech world for a while. It's been a question in the tech world for a while, for sure. And it's been something that we've been dealing with as researchers. AI just repeats what it's been given. So if the data set is biased, and if we're being real, all data is biased because of if culture is biased. There's all sorts of cultures in the world. Everyone has a slightly different opinion. Nobody has exactly the same idea on any topic. Everything is biased. But the bigger question is figuring out what is a negative bias versus like a bias. And the negative biases are what people try to figure out how to prevent when they try to set up uh, like a language model, and they want the language model to be aligned towards human preferences. They want to be aligned away from very dramatic biases and ableisms and isms in general. Um, we can do that but through a number of ways. The biggest one is providing a system prompt, which means we tell the AI that it has a particular personality, and we tell the AI that it's not racist, that it's not sexist, that it's not ageist, that it doesn't do this and it doesn't do that. And so when it's responding or generating a response, it doesn't do those things, and it is less biased in its output. Um, we are actively telling it not to be biased in those examples, and so we're not actually combating the problem of a biased data set. What other people do is they find that there are certain ways to use a language model that have it automatically go away from biased responses, which implies that language models do know what is a biased response, but they choose to do them regardless. And this is called steering. So you can steer the generation of a language model away from a biased response. And often that does work. But it's just now beginning to be in research, and Anthropic is the largest group of people researching this idea of steering. From Raj, could you please send me last Wednesday's online chat? I missed it last week. Thanks, Raj. You can find it in the forum. I think one of the teaching assistants can probably find it. It's just under module 2. There's a recording. From A.L. Brignoni, um, does anyone know whether AI is being used for climate change solutions or to combat greenwashing? That's an interesting question. 4 years ago, I was doing a research project for a professor who wanted to have a word list of words that appear in business documents related to climate change and more specifically greenwashing. When I took that word list, they wanted to bump that word list up a couple of times. So if you had, say, 500 words, they wanted to expand it to 2,000 words. So their statistical algorithms would be able to pick up more words from the overall business documents. And when I plugged it into GPT to see if GPT could come up with synonyms, because these language models are amazing at synonyms, it wasn't doing so well. So at that point, 2019, it wasn't the best at coming up with words for climate change and greenwashing, which might suggest they don't really have a sense of what that is. Nowadays, though, I totally believe that it is able to deal with climate change solutions insofar as they know how to talk about them. Whether I would turn to a language model to come up with a solution for climate change is another question entirely. From Michael Warren, uh, do you think generative AI will ever be able to produce 100% factual text? No, unfortunately. Spoke about this a little bit in last week's chat, and this comes up in Ted Chiang's piece and Emily Bender's piece, that they are lossy. The internet is humongous. There are, petabytes and petabytes of data that are uploaded on a daily basis. These models, I think the internet takes up like an exabyte or something of data. The Internet Archive, for example, they try to take a snapshot of every web page every day. They have a humongous amount of data. Humongous, humongous. You can't take all of that data and reduce it down to something that would fit on a USB stick or an SD card without introducing lossy information. And as soon as there is a loss of information, the language model does not know everything, and it will try to fill in the blanks. And so inaccuracies will crop up regardless, unless we come up with a way to perfectly reduce and compress information, which I don't think, if you listen to information theory, is actually possible. So we will never hit 100% factual text, but we can get pretty close. And moreover, people are never 100% factual in the first place. So I think it's a little bit of a question of, will we consider language models under the same standards as we do humans, or something different? And that's not a question that I'm equipped to be able to answer. From Alexandros Georgiadis, can language models assess their own accuracy? They can. And that's actually a very good technique for improving their accuracy, is you can just ask the language model to give you its confidence in its response on a scale of 1 to 10. And you can see that generally, if the language model is producing an inaccuracy, it will give you a lower score out of 10, which is amazing because that kind of indicates that they know that they don't know something. Um, so yeah, it's a little it's amazing that they do know when they're wrong, but for some reason it's very difficult to take that and tell them to always be correct. Or if they're not correct, just don't respond. The issue is that we do want them to respond, and we train them to always respond. So despite that onerous imposition that we put on these models, they nonetheless begin to figure out what is incorrect, what is correct, and we have to bridge the gap of what these models seem to know and what they do in practice. And that's something that we'll figure out in the next coming months. From Tomo Terada, I see that the forum is a lot more people interested in showing themselves as Mark Andreessen haters, which is fair. More than worrying about how journalists, as those like those from the Associated Press, are ignorant of the terms of the agreement between the company and OpenAI. I know it would be more incumbent on Aimee to answer, but could you comment on your view of the circumstance like this, where newsroom workers only know that AI is going to be implemented, but without knowing the goals of the company they work for to implement it? So if you're speaking specifically about the Associated Press, yes, indeed, that is something that Aimee should be answering. But I will say that often I think large newsrooms, and this is the sense I've gotten after having spoken to people at different organizations, high up people, they don't know. This is a little worrying to say. They might not necessarily know what they are doing. It takes a lot to become fluent in the ways of AI. You have to be a researcher at this point, because the resources for learning about them are either too simplistic or too technical, and it's very difficult to find a good middle boundary. And so, if you are a C-suite executive at a major newsroom, could we really expect them to know everything about a language model? The answer is probably no. And so, if I was working at a newsroom and I didn't know the goals of my company, I would have to, I guess, assume that they're doing the right thing. I am hopeful that the AP's exclusive licensing deal for their data with OpenAI is a good thing. I mean, the AP is a not nonprofit cooperative. They've always made decisions that I think are positive. And so, I mean, although I do know that there is some controversy with the Associated Press, especially in the late 1900s, but I think that's a little beside the point. I would not necessarily worry, though, to answer your question, if I was a worker in a newsroom and the higher ups are making decisions with regard to AI, because the flip side of it being onerous to know a lot about AI is that it's also unlikely that people will come up with uh, very evil applications because it just requires knowledge through and through. Maybe that's a decent response. So from Marco Flores, hi, are you aware of any AI products that help with debunking fake news? An activity that takes time out of producing content daily. Thanks. Um, for debunking fake news, that's a good question. I do know that Google has been funding fact-checking AI in East Asia, but any products in particular, no, I'm not aware. I think fact-checking, at least from the perspective of those that I've spoken to, they put a lot of value in a human fact-checking. So as soon as you take a human out of that loop, it's a little bit of like, what if the AI hallucinates when it's fact-checking? Does it really, can you trust in its output? Um, from Alexandros again, language models seem to easily fall into loops. Yeah. So the thing is that a language model is something that in statistics and probability theory we call autoregressive. And to be autoregressive means you regress to a mean on your own. Hence autoregressive. And the mean that the language model tries to fall on is however the conversation is going. It's interesting. They're a little bit like feedback loops, like with an amp and a guitar and a microphone, you know, strumming your guitar, goes out the amp, microphone picks it up, and all of a sudden you got, you know, like a high pitched noise because it's a feedback loop. It's going through this whole loop of electricity. And language models are the same. As soon as there is a consistent signal in their output, they will try to reinforce it because they're just predicting, let's remember, the overall conversation. They don't have a sense of I am the language model and you are the human. The whole transcript is something that they're trying to predict. It's a little bit of a fiction that there is two people talking in a transcript. From the language model's perspective, it's trying to predict the whole thing. And so if the conversation is going in a particular direction, because these language models are not necessarily self-aware, they will just reinforce that loop and keep working towards it. So if you do begin to run into a loop when talking to ChatGPT, for example, the best thing is to just not respond. Or to, sorry, the best thing is to delete the conversation and try again. So from Lynn, uh, I was amused when Bing Chat apologized when I called it out on a wrong answer and thanked me for the correction, but anthropomorphizing these things can be dangerous. Makes them seem safe and cuddly. How can that be addressed? Do you all remember at the beginning of this year when Bing Chat was released and it was a little bit neurotic? And I think in the New York Times, they released like a multi-page transcription of a reporter's interaction with Bing Chat, slowly devolving into a series of I love yous and I hate you and very kind of like bipolar conversation. Um, yeah, it is dangerous to anthropomorphize them too greatly because as soon as you do, you run into a situation where language models are going to betray that trust that you put in it. So anthropomorphization is not great because, first of all, these things are not conscious, right? They're not sentient, yet um, we very easily believe the things we read. I mean, up until 4 years ago, whenever you read anything on the internet, chances are it was written by another person. There was a sense that everybody is sentient. And now, because I've worked with these things for so long, and often they have such a particular way of speaking, when I'm just browsing around on Reddit or whatever, and I see someone talking, a little thing in the back of my head begins to say, is that a real person speaking? It reads a little bit like ChatGPT. And if you're a professor and you're grading your students' essays, you can imagine that they have the same question. Um, Anthropomorphization is definitely a bit of a danger, and it's important to remember that it is possible to do it, and it's very easy to do it. And as humans, I guess we're just so trusting. Um, but how can you address anthropomorphization? We get the language models to repeatedly insist that they are language models, but again, it's easy to get around that. And so I don't know if there is a clear solution other than just watermarking all text and having a big red light on in the chat window saying that, hey, you're not speaking to a human. For Michael Warren, how close are we to a reliable voice from text tool that could produce audio from text for all the news stories on a large and dynamic mainstream media site? So I was speaking to the former managing editor of The Atlantic earlier this year in April. I think he was about to retire, maybe, or something. And he was showing me his voice, reading out one of the Atlantic's articles that his staff had produced for him. It was not his voice, it was a computer, but it sounded like him. They had taken his voice from different Zoom calls, trained a model, and then has had his voice read out a series of articles. He was a little bit scared and he was a little bit angry, but he was also amused because, I mean, it was the staff members, it was something of a prank. But I would say that we are probably at the point where you can do it um, consistently, and you've got tools like 11 Labs, so you'll find it, um, where it does not cost very much to write some text and have it be read out with the voice of many, many, many people. Now, whether it's cost effective, I'm not so sure what the cost basis is for these tools, but I can imagine that it's just not simply far away. Um, from Al, have you seen the videos of Elon Musk dancing with hot and sexy bots? No, I'm not. From Derek, I teach media and news literacy at the college level. I'm beginning to think interactions with AI chatbots like ChatGPT should be part of the curriculum. I think there's a little bit of something in there. So I TA sometimes for English courses as a grad student, and I've gotten my professor to introduce ChatGPT as a topic because it's better to address it than not address it. And also because if we're teaching the students how to use ChatGPT, then if they clearly use it, we'll know that they know how to use it because we taught them how to use it. So there's no claim of innocence and I've never used that tool and I just don't know how to use ChatGPT, professor. I'm so sorry. It's better to be more open about these tools and admit that yes, there's a thing that can write pretty okay essays for you. And so yes, I think it should be added to curriculums, not necessarily as like the centerpiece, but definitely, have it on your syllabus, reference it a little bit. From Feta, I do not know if anyone asked this in earlier sessions, and it is not that important, but I'm interested in whether uh, AI companies largely based in English languages in the English language world pay attention to genders in other languages, yeah, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So I speak French, um, speak a bit of Dutch, uh, and at least with those, Western AI models, Western languages, Western European languages, ChatGPT is cognizant of gender. Pretty well, in fact, much more so than I am. I regularly, mess up my la. But I think it depends on the size of the model because ChatGPT is a big model and learns a lot about every language. Whereas if you're using something like Google Translate, the models it runs are very tiny because they're designed to be run by everybody all the time. They're small, compact, and so um, they might, you can imagine, screw up how these models screw up the gender of different languages. So from Derek is in favor of students using the tool responsibly, for sure. Are you in favor of them using them to write essays out of curiosity? Because that is not such a common opinion. So I just, here. And we have 5 more minutes. Awesome. From Beth. AI has been a sense of, Derek is in favor of using them for the writing process. Interesting. I'd like to hear from you later. So Beth has a point. AI has been around since the 50s. Totally. But we've had technical limits leading to AI winters. Absolutely. With quantum computing and larger data sets, the ideas of before are now possible. Um, yeah, we have humongous data sets that are really clean and very great and much better than data sets we've ever considered. So I think you can say that large language models are doing something that we would have never predicted before. They are indeed amazing, but whether they necessarily whether we will run into another AI winter is we don't know. Like maybe we will. My sense is that we won't, at least for the time being, because we continue to have really amazing advances. But they weren't predicting the AI winter in the 1980s. I mean, at least the funders weren't. I think the scientists had already like their gears have been put out of war action for like 10 years prior or something. But I mean, the funders did not predict it happening, and maybe we won't predict it happen either. From Ellen, sorry for a basic question. I am starting modules this week because I've been traveling for work conferences. And my question is everything we put into ChatGPT or Claude or Bard being used or put into training data sets? Yes, unfortunately. ChatGPT, if you pay money, they won't do that. But for the other models, they don't have sufficient privacy policies in place to prevent that from happening. And because they don't necessarily address it, I think the safe assumption is to assume that yes, they put them back into training data sets, which is not great. If you are concerned about your data, it's better to run a local model. And when I was in Argentina, I gave a workshop on how to use this tool, which is not the easiest to set up, but it's definitely interesting. And if you're on a Mac, you might be interested in using this tool, which is easy to set up. And even from there, there's an app on the App Store. Here, let me paste this one. There's an app on the App Store called MLC LLM that will run a language model on your own computer. So it does not upload anything to the web. And it works pretty well. And it's on the App Store for iPad, which means you can run it on your laptop or your iMac, and it runs in your phone. And I think it runs in the web browser if you have Chrome. So it's something to consider, is running your own language model. So from Sean, what are your thoughts on ChatGPT's ability to write code for auxiliary programs that journalists use? I'm thinking Blender for 3D, but also other tools. Yeah, so for data journalism work in particular, I've been finding that ChatGPT, if you pay for it, the code interpreter is really great for visualizations. So you can give it a CSV file or like a spreadsheet, and it will do data transformations, and you can tell it to look for certain signals, and it will write the statistical tests to come up with them. And then it will visualize everything. So it's amazing for data journalism work in particular. But Sean has found them that they're not great at writing Excel functions. Yeah, so for other purposes, they're not great. And in particular, I'm finding that the local language models that I'm proposing to use here is not the world's greatest at programming. So if you use ChatGPT to write code for you, the smaller the model gets, the less likely it is that it will write a correct and well-functioning solution. So it's a bit of a give and take, and it's difficult to predict in which tasks it does well and in other tasks it does not do well. And so yeah, I think ChatGPT will eventually do a lot of tertiary streamlining automated tasks, but as of right now, it's difficult to figure out when and where they do well. From Brignoni, any opinion on copyright law scenarios? That is currently under contestation. I think a whole bunch of different people are suing a bunch of different AI companies on different levels, class actions, personal tort law. I think we'll figure out with time whether the output generated by an AI model you can license it as your own IP, because right now I don't think you can. There was a graphic novel that somebody put out. It was generated, the text was generated by ChatGPT, the photos by Midjourney, and I think a judge ruled that the author could not declare that as their copyright. So we'll figure out with time whether that is possible. And with that, we are all out of time. So thanks very much for joining in this week, everybody. I hope your questions were answered. If not, feel free to shoot me a direct message on the forums or ask in the forums directly, and I'll get around to them. And other students, if they also know the answer, can get around as well. So thank you very much. I hope that was hopeful. Bye-bye.